There are men whom even the darkness refuses to keep for too long. Reed Holston was one of them, the kind of man neighbors avoided meeting in the eye, the kind that silenced a saloon the moment his boots touched the wooden floor. Even the night wind seemed to shift its course when it passed the ruined shack he called home. No one truly knew what Reed had once been. A warrior? An outcast? Or simply a lost soul wandering the dying towns of the frontier? All they saw was a man buried alive, hiding in the ashes of a past too dangerous for anyone to speak of. The town gave him names. The Voiceless, the Hollow Man, the Shadow's kin. But never his real one. They knew it, yet no one dared to awaken a memory that could catch fire like dry brush in the desert wind. Each dawn, Reed rose before the sun. He'd sit alone on his broken-back chair at the porch, watching crows wheel above the barren fields. No words, no sighs, only those hollow eyes, as if searching through dust and dirt for something long lost. While others began their work in the fields, Reed wandered toward the dry riverbed. He would scoop a handful of earth, clench it, then let the sand fall grain by grain, like time draining from a glass. To Reed, days had no meaning. Each one was but a faded copy of the last. A loop of silence, loneliness, and the shadow that clung to him like a second skin. And yet, beneath that weathered shell, something still smoldered. A flame, faint but not yet dead. Folks swore they'd seen it, his eyes catching a spark at the distant crack of gunfire. Others claimed those scarred hands still moved quick as lightning whenever they brushed a knife's hilt. Reed, though buried in silence, carried the instincts of a man who had once survived storms. But for what did he live? That was the question. No kin, no friends, no voice calling his name. Reed existed, but only as a ghost in the flesh, waiting for the final wind to scatter what remained. They say every lost soul is only waiting for a spark, a moment to shake the stillness. For Reed Holston, that moment was drawing near. He didn't know it. The town didn't know it. But soon the dusty trail he walked each day would be stained with blood, with tears, and with the chance to live once more. For fate, cruel as it may be, always remembers how to wake the hearts of those who have forgotten their own beat. The encounter and Reed's decision. That day, the town square was packed. Not because of goods or a special market, but because of something else, something that made both the poor and the rich jostle for space. A live auction. Under the burning sun, a girl was brought out, her hands bound. The rope bit into her wrists, turning the skin red. Her long hair was tangled, matted with dust and sweat. But her eyes, those eyes, still shone. A strange light, unbroken, unconquered. They called her Awanada T. The crowd buzzed like vultures waiting for a meal. Crude bids, mocking laughter, and vulgar remarks turned the square into a market of shame. To them, Awanada was not a human being. She was a rare object, a spoil of war to flaunt, to amuse themselves with. Reed stood at the edge of the crowd. He had not intended to come. His feet had merely carried him there out of a habitual, aimless wandering. But the moment he saw Awanada's gaze, his body froze. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but because he recognized something he had long forgotten. That gaze was a mirror of his younger self, when he had fought, when he had stared death in the face and dared to challenge it. The auctioneer raised his whip, shouting the starting price. Cheers and bids followed in rapid succession. A wealthy rancher waved a fistful of money. Another shouted he wanted to buy her to teach the savage girl a lesson. Awanada stood tall, silent. Yet her eyes swept across the crowd, searching for an escape, or at least a soul not yet compelled. In that moment, Reed knew. If he turned away, the girl would disappear from this world. Not by death, but by being buried in the hands of another. A slow, meaningless death, much like the life he himself had been living. The bids grew more frantic. No one paid attention to the thin, dusty man standing silently under a tree. Reed clenched his fists. Veins throbbed in his neck. Two voices rang in his mind. One whispered, "Don't get involved. It's none of your business." The other screamed, "If you do nothing, you'll die right here. Die like a coward, even while your body still stands. Reed stepped forward. One step alone made several heads turn. No one expected him to speak, but his voice rang out, hoarse, mingling with dust and wind. I bid. For a moment, the square fell silent. Then murmurs spread. Who the hell is that? That old man's still alive? Reed Holston, he dares? The auctioneer frowned, eyeing Reed from head to toe. Clearly, he didn't have enough money to compete. But something in those eyes made him hesitate. The eyes of a man familiar with violence. A man who, even empty-handed, could make others wary. Some ranchers laughed and gave up. To them, it wasn't worth spending more to fight a madman. But others chose to provoke. The bids climbed higher and higher. Reed did not flinch. Each time a rival raised the price, he nodded in return. No one knew where he got the money. In truth, Reed himself did not know. But he understood one thing clearly. This was not about buying or selling. This was a wager with fate. Either he would win, or he would die right before everyone's eyes. Finally, the crowd grew tired. The auctioneer lowered his whip. Sold to Reed Holston. A ripple of astonishment spread. Reed stepped forward and untied Awanada's wrists. He did not look at her, merely cut the rope and laid it on the ground. But in that moment their eyes met. No words were exchanged, only acknowledgement. Reed had broken the girl's chains, and in doing so, he shattered the invisible prison that had held him captive for years. He did not buy Awanada. He chose her, and that choice sent him down a path from which there was no turning back. The first night and building cautionary trust. That first night in the decaying house, silence was no longer familiar. It was a test. Reed lay on the creaking old bed, the thin mattress steeped in the musty scent of many rainy seasons. He did not sleep. His eyes were wide open in the darkness, ears straining to catch every small sound in the house. Across the room, Awanada spread a thin blanket on the wooden floor. No request, no complaint. She chose a spot against the wall, back resting on the wood, eyes staring into nothingness, more like a sentinel than someone trying to rest. The strangest thing was not the house, nor the darkness. It was the presence of each other. Reed had grown so accustomed to living alone that the very breath of another person felt like a threat. Awanada, having once slept under the stars with her freedom taken away, felt an acute alertness within four walls. The wind whistled through a crack in the door, making the hinges clatter. Reed shifted, letting out a quiet sigh. Awanada flinched, her hand gripping a small piece of wood she held like a makeshift dagger. Their eyes met in the dim light. No trust, only the lingering question. Who among us will betray first? Hours passed. Sleep did not come. Reed thought of the afternoon, when he had decided to step in and change the girl's fate. He wondered if it had been a mistake. His door, long closed to the world, now open to a stranger. A stranger carrying not only mystery but danger. Awanada, in silence, watched every move Reed made. She did not know who he was, nor why he had chosen to intervene. In this land, no one helped another without purpose. She had to prepare for the worst, and so, she did not sleep. Her eyes shone in the dark like those of a hunting beast, always ready to strike. Yet there were small moments that shook her suspicion. Like when Reed slowly sat up to add wood to the fire, the light revealing his hands, trembling, calloused. Not the hands of a schemer, but of someone who had endured great loss. Or when he left a cup of water near her, saying nothing, looking nowhere, simply an act that reminded her she could drink if thirsty. Those small details, without explanation, were fragile threads slowly bridging the distance between them. Night passed its halfway point. Outside, distant wolf howls echoed. Reed glanced toward her and saw Awanada still awake. He croaked, "Horse, wolves." She did not answer, but her eyes moved in the direction of the sound, as if acknowledging she had heard it too. For the first time in the darkness, there was a shared moment, brief. Hearing together, alert together, existing together. Near dawn, Awanada closed her eyes. Not because she completely trusted him, but because her body could no longer resist fatigue. Before slipping into shallow sleep, she still held the piece of wood in her hand. Reed sat up and watched her for a moment. In that instant, he recognized the courage in the young girl, a vigilance no different than his own when he was much younger. And unconsciously, he felt he owed her something. The sky brightened. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the door crack, shining on the two of them in the dilapidated room. Neither had slept deeply, yet they had survived a night without knives, without betrayal. For them, that was the first step toward trust. Not complete trust, only an unspoken agreement. I will not harm you if you do not harm me. But sometimes, such a small beginning is enough to pave the way for greater things. And so, in that crumbling wooden house, something began to sprout. Not kinship, not love, yet, but cautious companionship, a fragile trust more precious than any spoken promise. The first night and building cautionary trust. That first night in the decaying house, silence was no longer familiar. It was a test. Reed lay on the creaking old bed, the thin mattress steeped in the musty scent of many rainy seasons. He did not sleep. His eyes stayed wide in the darkness, his ears straining to catch every small sound in the house. Across the room, Awanada spread a thin blanket on the wooden floor. No request, no complaint. She chose a spot against the wall, back resting on the wood, her eyes staring into nothingness, more like a sentinel than someone trying to rest. The strangest thing was not the house, nor the darkness. It was the presence of each other. Reed had grown so accustomed to living alone that even the breath of another person felt threatening. Awanada, having once slept under the stars with her freedom taken away, felt an acute alertness within four walls. The wind whistled through a crack in the door, making the hinges clatter. Reed shifted, letting out a quiet sigh. Awanada flinched, her hand gripping a small piece of wood she held like a makeshift dagger. Their eyes met in the dim light. There was no trust, only the lingering question, who among us will betray first? Hours passed. Sleep did not come. Reed thought of the afternoon, when he had decided to step in and change the girl's fate. He wondered if it had been a mistake. His door, long closed to the world, now open to a stranger. A stranger carrying not only mystery but also danger. Awanada, in silence, watched Reed's every move. She did not know who he was, nor why he had chosen to intervene. In this land, no one helped another without purpose. She had to prepare for the worst, and so, she did not sleep. Her eyes shone in the dark like those of a hunting beast, always ready to strike. Yet there were small moments that shook her suspicion. Like when Reed slowly sat up to add wood to the fire, the light revealing his hands, trembling, calloused. Not the hands of a schemer, but of someone who had endured great loss. Or when he left a cup of water near her, saying nothing, looking nowhere, simply an act reminding her she could drink if thirsty. Those small details, without explanation, were fragile threads slowly bridging the distance between them. Night passed its halfway point. Outside, distant wolf howls echoed. Reed glanced toward her and saw Awanada still awake. He croaked, "Horse, wolves." She did not answer, but her eyes moved in the direction of the sound, as if acknowledging she had heard it too. For the first time in the darkness, there was a shared moment, brief. Hearing together, alert together, existing together. Near dawn, Awanada closed her eyes. Not because she completely trusted him, but because her body could no longer resist fatigue. Before slipping into shallow sleep, she still held the piece of wood in her hand. Reed sat up and watched her for a moment. In that instant, he recognized the courage in the young girl, a vigilance no different than his own when he was much younger. And unconsciously, he felt he owed her something. The sky brightened. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the door crack, shining on the two of them in the dilapidated room. Neither had slept deeply, yet they had survived a night without knives, without betrayal. For them, that was the first step toward trust. Not complete trust, only an unspoken agreement. I will not harm you if you do not harm me. But sometimes, such a small beginning is enough to pave the way for greater things. And so, in that crumbling wooden house, something began to sprout. Not kinship, not love yet, but cautious companionship, a fragile trust more precious than any spoken promise. First days of work and breaking the silence. The dawn of the following days was no longer the same as before. The house, once familiar with only one presence, now echoed with steps, sometimes overlapping, sometimes out of sync, forming a rough but living rhythm. Reed usually went outside early, checking the fences, inspecting the abandoned horse stalls, and gathering rotted planks. He did not expect help. But Awanada, without a word, set to work as if she had always lived there. She carried water from the well, her small, thin shoulders strong and steady. She gathered stones to rebuild the outdoor fireplace. She bent over to pick up dry firewood, stacking it neatly along the walls. Reed observed everything silently. He had been used to solitude, but the silence shared with another felt somehow less heavy. On the third day, Awanada ventured to the back garden. It was just a patch of barren land, weeds growing among thorn bushes. Reed paused his hammer and watched from afar as she knelt, using a broken shard of pottery to turn over the soil. The dry seeds stored in her cloth bag were placed into the earth one by one, each grain laid down like a ritual. He realized this was work she had seen all her life in her tribe, sowing seeds, even without certainty that the soil would sprout. One afternoon, a hot wind swept across the yard, making the eaves creak. Reed tied the rope securing the roof. When he looked down, he saw Awanada standing near the horse stall, her hand resting on the wood as if speaking to the spirit of a lost animal. He slowly approached. "The horse has been dead a long time," he croaked. Awanada lifted her eyes, showing no expression. After a few seconds, she replied briefly, her voice low but clear. The bones still remember the steps. It was the first time she spoke. Reed remained silent. He did not fully understand, but he realized one thing. In her world, even what is gone leaves a breath behind. After that, silence was no longer absolute. That brief sentence opened a crack, and through it, the two began to exchange more, only fragments, incomplete, but enough to change the rhythm of daily life. On the fourth day, when he clumsily started a fire and smoke stung his eyes, Awanada quietly said, "Place the wood crosswise. The fire breathes easier." Reed followed her advice. The flames rose neatly. He glanced at her and nodded slightly, a rare gesture from him. On the fifth day, Reed lifted a heavy plank. His shoulders shook, his hands slipping off the edge. Awanada immediately caught it, her tanned hands gripping the side. Together they lowered it to the ground. Gasping, Reed glanced at her and muttered, "Strong enough." Awanada replied calmly, "Not weak." Short phrases, sometimes only a single word, became their new language. A form of mutual affirmation, replacing the initial doubt. By the seventh day, under the full moon shining over the field, the two sat on the doorstep. The night was no longer as tense as the first night. The wind carried the scent of damp soil from the freshly turned garden. Awanada quietly asked, in a small voice as if afraid to hear herself, "Why did you save me?" Reed took a few beats before replying. He stared into the distance, where sky and earth met. Finally, he spoke each word deliberately, "Because I was once abandoned too." The silence after his answer was not heavy. It became the foundation of understanding. No more reasons, no arguments needed. In that moment, a bond was formed. Not a forced tie, but a choice to walk together. Two survivors, finding their reflection in the other. From that day on, silence was no longer a distance. It became their language, a language woven through work, brief phrases, and the acknowledgement that, though the outside world remained harsh, here, at least, they were no longer entirely alone. Deeper conversations and shared vulnerabilities. Night fell, and the house was silent, as if holding its breath. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, casting streaks of light across the wooden ceiling. Reed sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup. Awanada sat opposite him, back against a post, knees pulled close to her chest. No one spoke, but silence, stretched too long, eventually became a question. Awanada bent down, picking up a small piece of wood. Using a dull knife, she etched a few short, deliberate lines into its surface. When she placed the wood on the table, the carved lines formed a bird spreading its wings, one wing thin, as if torn by the wind. Reed stared at it for a moment, a flicker in his eye. No words were needed. He understood. Some things still want to fly even when they are broken. She spoke first, her voice low, as though afraid to shatter the air. I used to think, if I stayed silent long enough, the pain would forget my name. She paused, searching for the right words. But it doesn't forget. It only learns to stay, waiting in the night. Reed did not interrupt. He let the wind drift in from the porch before asking, in a tone so soft it barely sounded like a question. Which night? The night that smelled of smoke, she replied. Her eyes did not meet his. They looked past him, toward some distant place. The night when the faces of those I loved turned to ash in my memory. I remember footsteps pounding the ground. I remember my father's hand pushing me into the shadows, whispering, Don't breathe too loud. Reed set down his cup, fingers brushing unconsciously against the chipped rim. He asked no more. Each of her words carried weight enough to rock this table if he tried to pry them. After a long pause, he said, I understand what it means to stay silent to survive. His voice was hoarse yet steady. Some days, silence is the last armor. For the first time, Awanada looked straight at him. What did you have to stay silent for? Reed leaned back, eyes lingering on the dark beam above. After a long moment, he chose only a few words, few enough to count on his fingers. Because I stayed when others didn't. He swallowed hard. Because I didn't turn back in time. The words were short but heavy, like a stone placed on the table. Awanada asked no who, no when. She simply slid the wooden piece with the bird closer to him, as if to say, This is yours if you wish to keep it. They sat longer, long enough for the embers to crackle. Then Reed opened another lock inside himself. I used to believe that if I worked enough, memories would wear away like a hoe on soil. But some things shine brighter the more you touch them. He looked at his calloused hands. And I'm afraid that if I speak, the whole house will collapse. Awanada pressed her lips together and nodded lightly, like someone listening to a language they had always known. I understand. She opened her palm, revealing a small scar along her wrist. I keep stories here. When no one listens, I tell them to the scar. Reed stared at the scar longer than necessary. He did not pity it. He merely acknowledged it as proof of existence. I'm not good at listening, he admitted. But tonight, if you want, you can let silence tell your story. Awanada smiled faintly. Your silence isn't frightening, she said. It's like the shade of a tree. Standing beneath it, you feel less heat. A moment of quiet passed, healing. Awanada continued, not in sequence, but in the rhythm of her heart. Old rainy seasons, the vanished songs of ceremonies, the stone ring her father gave her one dusty morning. She did not speak of the day everyone expected, only of the times before, to show that her life had held more colors than the hue of loss. Reed listened as if a traveler in the desert had suddenly found water. He did not fill the space with cheap, I understand as. He remembered. When she paused, he placed his palm on the table, near the carved wood. I don't remember all the faces, he admitted. But I remember my name being called, far away. He drew a deep breath. And I hate it, because it's still close enough to hurt. Awanada leaned in, moving the wood closer, adding a support line under the fragile wing. A line of reinforcement. Like this, she said. When the wind blows the wrong way, the weak wing can lean on the other. Reed nodded lightly, as if in thanks. From tomorrow, he said slowly, if there's ever a day that feels hard to breathe, we'll signal each other by placing this piece of wood on the table. He looked at her. No words needed. Agreed, Awanada replied. And if either of us talks too much, the other will pour water. To stop at the right moment. They smiled. Not because it was funny, but because they had, for the first time, set a gentle rule for the house. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, two people had placed a small object between them, a real bridge, small yet tangible. When the last ember died, they no longer feared the dark. Awanada pulled the blanket over her shoulders and stood. Before turning away, she laid her hand on the edge of the table, right next to where Reed rested. A quick touch, no seeking, no promise. Just a mark confirming. Tonight, they had both passed through a door. Reed stayed a little longer, looking at the carved wings. He realized he was breathing evenly. Not because the burden had lessened, but because there was now a second rhythm in the house. The rhythm of two people understanding that wounds need not disappear for life to be shared. He blew out the lamp wick. Darkness filled the room but did not claim all the space. In one corner, among the lingering warmth of the embers, a bond had been tied, not tight, not ornate, just enough to remind them that, from this night onward, each of their pains had a place to rest. The first kiss and unspoken intimacy. Night fell softly, like a dark cloth draped over every corner of the house. There were no promises, no plans. Just the moment when all outside sounds faded, leaving only the rhythm of their breaths to be heard. Reed leaned against the doorframe, eyes tracing the dim space before the porch. Awanada sat a few steps away, her gaze calm like windless water. Both of them knew something was shifting. Not loudly, not ostentatiously, but unmistakably. Awanada moved first. She walked slowly, neither timid nor challenging, as if measuring the distance with her own courage. When she stopped in front of Reed, she tilted her head slightly. She asked nothing, sought no permission. She only reached out, lightly brushing the veins on his wrist. A touch delicate as a question, yet steady. Reed did not pull away. A flicker of old caution appeared in his eyes, then vanished like embers smothered by ash. Awanada placed her palm against his chest, feeling the beat of a heart like a horse that had long stopped running, yet still remembered the way. She lifted her face. The distance closed. Their warmth brushed the edge of each other's space. And it was Awanada, no one else, who closed that distance. The first kiss was not a storm. It was a whisper, gentle and clear. A silent declaration. We are alive, and we see each other. Lips met without haste, without possession. It was the touch of those familiar with loss, held as one would hold something fragile. Not forceful, but never hesitant. When they parted, no words were spoken. Awanada kept her hand on Reed's chest, and for the first time in years, he left a space within himself for another to enter. She did not smile. She only looked straight at him, carving an invisible mark on his face. A sign only they understood. From that night, nothing was dramatic. Everything shifted through small movements. In the morning, when Reed tied a rope to a post, Awanada stood by, adding another loop, tightening it neatly. Their fingers brushed briefly, without withdrawing. At noon, when he placed a bowl on the table, she turned it to match his dominant hand, a habit taught by no one. In the evening, when he sat on the doorstep, she leaned against the wooden frame beside him, close enough for warmth to mingle, distant enough to respect a boundary only they knew. Their intimacy grew without needing a name. It thrived in unconscious glances, in footsteps that coincidentally fell in rhythm, in saving the better portion for the other without explanation. Reed spoke even less, but each nod carried a new meaning. I understand. Awanada, long accustomed to silence, now used it to embrace him softly, firmly. One night, wind swirled around the porch. Awanada stood behind Reed, adjusting the fabric draped over his shoulder. Her fingers paused over an old scar, tracing lightly as if reading letters carved in stone. Reed held his breath, not from pain, but from surprise at the tenderness touching a place thought numb. He turned. She did not withdraw. Their eyes met for a long few seconds, then Awanada leaned in. A second kiss, less hesitant, deeper, like confirming words already spoken. No binding words, no ceremony. Yet the old boundary had passed. Between them now was a quiet circle, where even a hand's touch could mean a promise. On another night, moonlight scattered silver across the floor. They sat closer. Reed placed his hand nearby, neither seeking nor pulling. Awanada laid her hand over his, intertwining fingers naturally. Time seemed to pause. They did not count the years lost, nor measure dangers ahead. They simply acknowledged a simple truth, a place to lean on, even for a single extended breath. Their closeness required no words. Before others, they remained two shadows working quietly. But when alone, their eyes spoke. I am here. And that here was strong enough to push back some of the darkness around them. One colder than usual night, the fire died quickly. Awanada pulled the thin blanket over Reed's shoulders. He tried to return it, but she shook her head, signaling keep it with a firm frown. Reed did not argue. He shifted, leaving her the remaining warmth of the hearth. No one claimed more. They shared heat like sharing a secret. Silent, but complete. By the third kiss, it was no longer a surprise. It was the natural result of days spent learning to stand close without causing harm. Awanada again initiated, but this time Reed received it as if it already belonged to him. Not possession, acceptance. In that moment, lips pressed together, they both recognized. They had moved from doubt to acknowledgement, from acknowledgement to giving, and all without a single loud word. When they parted, the world remained unchanged. The wind still blew, insects still sang. But in the small space between them, a new order had formed. Reed gently rested his forehead against Awanada's, a rare gesture, simple yet heavy with meaning known only to them. Awanada closed her eyes, exhaling softly, as if answering a question left unspoken. From then on, unspoken intimacy became habit. Bowls placed where the other could reach, jackets folded neatly and left where the other sat. A light touch on the elbow passing through a narrow door. Each detail became a small stone, paving the shared path they were walking. And while each dawn remained pale, they carried something deeper. A commitment ensigned, untied, yet enduring through every gesture. We will hold each other in this silence, for as long as we can. Shared life and deepening bond. Winter had truly arrived. No longer were there damp mornings or wind whistling through the canyon walls. Now snow covered every path. Reed's wooden house, once merely a temporary shelter, had become an isolated island in an endless sea of white. In that stillness, Reed and Awanada had to rely on each other. Not just to survive, but to endure the loneliness. Yet what they did not realize at first was that this closeness was transforming everything. By day, Reed chopped wood, keeping the hearth always glowing. Awanada, accustomed to nomadic life, knew how to make use of every scrap of animal hide, every strand of rope, turning them into tools and useful items. They worked together, speaking little but never absent from each other's presence. The silence no longer felt heavy as it had in the early days. It was like a breath, like two rivers flowing side by side, strong even without touching. The long nights proved the true challenge. Wind howled through the cracks, cold slipping through every crevice. Reed added more wood, yet the mountain chill was relentless. In the small room, they curled tightly in thick blankets, yet the cold still crept in. Reed glanced at Awanada, lying quietly, her breathing steady but shoulders slightly trembling. He hesitated. Should he extend an invitation, or leave the distance between them as a fragile wall? Unexpectedly, it was Awanada who broke it. One night, as the wind screamed outside, she turned slightly, her deep black eyes reflecting the firelight. No words, only a decisive motion. She moved closer. Reed froze for a moment. His chest thumped as if he were facing the battlefield for the first time. Yet when her shoulder brushed against his chest, the hesitation vanished. From that moment, the distance between them ceased to exist. Each night, Awanada slept in Reed's arms, and it required no explanation. Outside, snow fell endlessly, sealing the valley. Inside, two people from different worlds found a shared home. They began to share not only work but the rhythm of life itself. Reed told her about harvest seasons on the plains, about a family he once had but lost to war. Awanada listened, her eyes reflecting a complex emotion. Not pity, but empathy. Then it was her turn. Stories of children torn from their mothers, of long treks just to escape the hateful eyes of strangers. In that small room, old wounds were uncovered. But instead of bleeding, they healed, like two cracked pieces of wood mended over the hearth's fire. Day by day, Reed realized he no longer saw Awanada as a stranger taking temporary refuge. He began to notice her in the smallest daily actions. Her skillful hands mending a torn coat, her light footsteps moving through the kitchen, the serene gaze as she watched the snow fall, as if she had grown accustomed to all change. Awanada too gradually accepted what she had once refused, that this place, with four walls and this rough but quiet man, had become part of her life. Neither of them spoke it aloud. Yet the truth became clear each night. When she returned to Reed's bed, it no longer meant simply to stay warm, but a choice to remain. One morning, as weak sunlight filtered through the window, Reed opened his eyes to find Awanada still beside him. Her hair was tangled, her warm breath brushing his shoulder. Unconsciously, he understood that the decision had been made without a word. She would not leave. Not only because the snow blocked every road, but because her heart had chosen to stay. And so, in the longest winter, Reed was no longer the solitary man of the mountains. Awanada was no longer a wandering woman without roots. Amid the blizzard, they had found the most enduring refuge in each other. New beginnings and the promise of family. That morning, soft golden sunlight fell upon the wooden porch, leaving dancing streaks across the dew-tinged ground. Reed was long accustomed to this quiet, yet today it carried a different weight. Inside the house, Awanada sat silently before the small wooden table. Her hands gently caressed a tiny object, the silver glinting so brightly that even Reed, used as he was to the cold steel of guns and knives, felt his chest tighten. It was a ring, a simple silver band, without elaborate engraving, yet enough to make the room seem to hold its breath. Awanada held it delicately, as if it were so fragile it might shatter if she gripped it too tightly. When Reed stepped closer, she said nothing. She merely lifted her gaze, her eyes deep and vast, carrying the weight of countless seasons of wind across the plains. Then, with a resolve that set Reed's heart ablaze, Awanada took his hand and placed the ring on his finger. No spoken proposal, no crowd to witness. Only two hearts that had survived the harshest winter together. And in that moment, Reed knew she had chosen him. Not temporarily, not merely as a refuge from life's storm, but to stay, to commit, to step into a new life alongside him. Reed stood motionless, feeling as if he had turned to stone. Gunfights, enemy pursuits, none had made him tremble as he did now. "Awanada," he whispered, voice catching. She smiled. A gentle smile Reed had thought would never belong to him. A vow unspoken rested quietly in that silence. Time passed. The snow gradually melted, and spring returned quietly. Within the small house, peace was no longer only in the crackling fire, but in the simplest of things. Shared meals, the scent of baking bread spreading through the kitchen, the sound of Awanada's footsteps across the wooden floor. Reed realized he was beginning to dream of a home, something he had once thought distant, even unworthy of him. One afternoon, as the sunset filtered through the window, Awanada gently placed her hand on her belly, a small, natural gesture, yet her eyes shone with a radiant light. Reed noticed it, and before he could speak, she said softly, "Reed, I carry a life within me." In that instant, the world seemed to pause. He looked at her, unable to believe his ears. His heart raced like hooves thundering across the plains. A wave of emotion surged beyond words. All he could do was grasp her hand tightly, eyes filled with a mixture of awe and joy. A child, their child, a living symbol of a love that had endured doubt, trials, and the barriers between two worlds. To Reed, it was not merely joyous news, it was salvation. After years as a wanderer, without family, without a place to belong, he now had something to call his own. Awanada looked at him, her smile calm and steadfast. She knew that from that moment on, they were no longer just companions through the blizzard. They had become a family, And this family, though small, would be a strong fortress against all of life's storms. That night, with moonlight spilling through the window, Reed could not sleep. He lay listening to Awanada's steady breathing beside him. Her hand rested lightly on her belly, a sacred affirmation. Reed reached out to touch her hair, whispering something he had never imagined he could say. "You've given me a reason to live, to fight, to stop running." His life had once been nothing but journeys without destination. But now he was no longer the solitary Reed. He was Reed, the husband of Awanada, the father of the child growing within her arms. From the moment the silver ring graced his finger, from the instant Awanada shared her news, a new beginning had unfolded. No longer strangers seeking shelter in each other, they had become a family they built themselves, needing no approval from the town, and no acceptance from the two worlds that had always doubted them. And here, on this harsh frontier, they had found what so many others had missed: a fresh start and the promise of a future where love, connection, and a small new life would become the guiding light for them both. Commitment and forging a future. Love, once it has survived trials, is no longer just fleeting attraction or passionate moments. It becomes a choice made each day, the choice to stay, the choice to walk forward together. For Reed and Awanada, after months of weathering blizzards, fear, and dark memories side by side, that bond had grown into something solid, something with a clear shape, a shared future. One winter night, the firelight flickered across their faces as Awanada gently rested her hand on her belly, the small life growing within her. Reed looked on, his steel-gray eyes no longer reflecting only the unease of a man long accustomed to solitude. For the first time, his gaze revealed longing. "Who do you think it will look like?" Awanada asked softly, a touch of hesitation in her voice, as if speaking the thought aloud was almost too great to believe. Reed paused, then a faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips. "If it looks like you, I'll know that God has never abandoned us." No words were needed beyond that moment. The fire crackled, bearing witness to a beginning. They no longer spoke of whether tomorrow will survive, but of their child, their long and distant tomorrow together. As snow blanketed the roof outside, inside the small wooden house, Reed and Awanada began to shape the contours of a family. They discussed names, sometimes seriously, sometimes playfully, to chase away the shyness that lingered. "If it's a boy," Reed said, "I want him to carry my father's name, Samuel. The man who taught me how to keep my word, how to stand tall against the wind." Awanada listened and nodded softly. "And if it's a girl, I want her to carry my mother's name, Nayeli. The woman who taught me to listen to my own heart, even when the world outside denied everything." These names were more than labels. They carried memory, tradition, both pain and pride from two worlds that had once been at odds. Now, under this roof, these names could stand side by side, a quiet affirmation that their love had not only defied prejudice but was opening a new path for the next generation. One morning, as the sun peeked over the snow-capped mountains, Awanada placed an old silver bracelet on the wooden table. It bore Apache patterns, a rare keepsake from her family. "I want our child to know it belongs to both worlds," she said, eyes fixed on Reed. He silently picked up the bracelet and placed on it a small iron ring he had forged during rainy, windy days. "And it should also know that its parents chose each other, not out of obligation, but because there was no other path they wanted to walk." The gesture was simple, yet it was a vow. No wedding, no minister, no community witnessing. But for them, it was the truest pledge, that even if the world turned its back, they would create a small world of their own. In the days that followed, Reed began constructing a small annex beside the main cabin. "For the child to have a place to play," he said, sweat streaking his face despite the bitter cold. Every swing of the hammer, every plank fitted into place, was a declaration. He was no longer a lone man in the wilderness. He was a husband, a father, preparing a home. Awanada did the same. She wove thick wool blankets, each stitch carrying hope. In them, she saw her own past, stories she would later share with the child, so it would know that the blood running in its veins carried both traditions, both pain and both pride. Their conversations were no longer brief or cautious. Now, whenever they sat together, they imagined the laughter of a child echoing through the cabin. Afternoons spent teaching archery or weaving cloth. "I'll teach him to ride a horse," Reed said, his eyes distant but determined. "And I'll teach her to listen to the wind." Awanada smiled, as if she could already see the future before them. Each word was more than a dream. It was a bond, tightening their love, turning it into responsibility, and transforming responsibility into the joy of choice. That love, in the silent depths of winter, was no longer a fire about to burn out. It had become a glowing ember, quiet, enduring, enough to warm an entire life. And in the eyes of both Reed and Awanada, a single truth shone clearly. They had chosen each other, and from now on, no matter how fierce the storms outside, they would face them together to the very end. The story ends here, yet it is also a beginning. For their love is not merely a fire to warm the cold nights, but a torch that lights an entire future. And when history records the events of the wild frontier, there will surely be a line remembering the lovers who chose each other, and chose hope amid countless storms.